Hello, it's Peter Fujiwara back again for our final episode in the video iPhoneography series. And this episode is on finding a story and next steps. Let's begin by separating the two kinds of stories that you may want to film. First, there's the narrative or scripted kind of film, where you have pre-production planning, shot lists, actors, and directing. The second would be documentary, where it's unscripted. Now, this one, you may have some shots planned, but the story unfolds in an unplanned manner. Regardless of the kind of story that you choose, I would recommend doing two different things in order to choose your film. First is watch, listen, and read. And second is think like a filmmaker. When I say watch, I mean watch the world unfold around you. See what's actually happening, and then infer the larger story behind the actions that you see. Then listen. And listen very carefully when people speak to you. Try to sense the emotion behind the words that they're saying, and ask leading questions to find more detail in the story that they're sharing. And lastly, read regularly. And as you read, form detailed images in your mind that enhance your understanding of the story you're reading. And this leads to the second item, thinking like a filmmaker. As you watch, listen, and read, imagine the shots that you could take to tell the story. Also, think of the sequence of those shots that would lead to a climatic part of that story that you want to tell in your film. Then start looking at lighting and shadows, and then listen to the audio around you. Think of all these things as you're thinking of the kind of film that you'd want to make. If you do this regularly enough, you'll actually learn how to do film better. So how do you choose the right story? Now, there's different ways to begin. First, decide whether you're thinking of a narrative or a documentary. If it's a narrative, then think of whether you're going to do a narration or whether you're going to do a dramatization. Then decide if you can acquire or capture both the images and audio to make your story come to life. Now, this may sound very complicated at first, but you don't have to shoot everything. In fact, the first time you try a narrative, what you may want to do is just read the narrative as an audio piece and then go get some clips that help tell that story. So, for example, let's listen to this story, which is taken from my favorite book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, Volume 1. So let's listen to this one, and then you can decide for yourself if you could do this as your first film. One at a time. A friend of ours was walking down a deserted Mexican beach at sunset. As he walked along, he began to see another man in the distance. As he grew nearer, he noticed that the local native kept leaning down, picking up something and throwing it into the water. Time and again, he kept hurling things out into the ocean. As our friend approached even closer, he noticed the man was picking up starfish that had been washed up on the beach, and one at a time, he was throwing them back into the water. Our friend was puzzled. He approached the man and said, "Good evening, friend. I was wondering what you're doing." "I'm throwing these starfish back into the ocean. You see, it's low tide right now, and all of these starfish have been washed up onto the shore. If I don't throw them back into the sea, they'll die up here from lack of oxygen." "I understand," my friend replied, "but there must be thousands of starfish on this beach. You can't possibly get to them all. There are simply too many. And don't you realize this is probably happening on hundreds of beaches, all up and down the coast? Can't you see you can't possibly make a difference?" The local native smiled, bent down, and picked up yet another starfish. And as he threw it back into the sea, he replied, "Made a difference to that one." Now, one of the keys to choosing a good narrative story is Does it have a message that speaks to you? And that particular story, even though you've probably heard it before, always speaks to me. The smallest action can make the difference. So you may want to make a film out of that, and you may be thinking like, how am I going to get to a Mexican beach? How am I going to get starfish and things like that? But if you look online, you could probably find just a person standing on a beach. And you could probably find a picture of a starfish. And how could you sequence those to tell that story? And that could be the start of your first film. So think about doing something like that for your first narrative. Now, if you're thinking maybe you'd like to do a documentary, now that's a large undertaking, finding that story, figuring out what to do. Now, my recommendation is start with a simple news story. Now, a news story actually has a simple formula that you can follow to start telling the story just like you would a documentary. And they involve a series of different components. First thing you have is what's called a piece to camera, where the news reporter speaks on camera, introduces themselves and the name of the story. Next, they start to tell part of the story, and you put B-roll over top, images that you capture about the story. Say it's like a soccer game. You have shots of people kicking the ball and moving around. Then you always have an interview with a player or a coach. So you ask them questions, just like you would in a documentary. And then as they speak, if they say something that you have B-roll for, you throw B-roll over top of that, just like you would do in a documentary. And then the final piece is a closing piece to camera, where the reporter closes off and sends it back to the studio. Now, many of you might be thinking, do I need to go buy new camera equipment, or can I still use my iPhone? I want you to think about what Steven Soderbergh said at 2018 at Sundance. Basically said, I think I'm going to stop filming in studios and just continue shooting with my iPhone. So if a professional director is actually thinking that an iPhone is capable of shooting feature-length films, then I think you could continue with your iPhone as well. Now, some of you may be thinking, I like learning things and I like getting more knowledge and skills. And you should be making films, but if you also want to gain more knowledge and skills, there's always something to learn. So if I was to recommend what those things were, I would recommend the first thing you do is lighting. Don't go buy lights. Just start shooting at different times of the day and find out what the golden hour is. That's an exciting way to shoot. Then you could think of getting things like reflectors, but a reflector doesn't have to cost you anything. It's simply something that reflects light, a piece of foil, a white piece of paper, a sheet. Anything that reflects light is a reflector. And just think about how those things can affect the way the image would look. The next item, it's a natural lead up from light, is color. So think of the different things you can do with color. Now, there's a way to get what's called more dynamic range, so you end up with better color shooting with Filmic Pro, the app that I recommend. If you shoot in log profile, it gives you greater dynamic range, and in post-production, you can pull up richer color. So think about that as something to learn. Then the last things would be your editing techniques, your visual effects, and your refinement of your audio and your capturing of music. Those things are all post-production things that you could learn. Now, if you only have an iOS device, I would recommend highly you look at LumaFusion, which is probably the best video editor you can buy on an iOS device. If you're thinking, I have a Mac and maybe I'd like to move these things onto my Mac, then I would look at Final Cut Pro X and Motion and Logic Pro X. All those are professional level editors that could really up your game, and there's tons to learn. And that brings us to the end of the video iPhoneography series. I hope you've enjoyed the last 8 weeks. To recap, let's go over what we've learned. In episode 1, we covered the purpose of video: know, think, feel, and then hopefully action. In episode 2, we did shot types and when to use them. In episode 3, we did camera moves, which included that cool slider shot. And then in episode 4, we did video production workflow and matched action and understanding how to cut on action. And then in episode 5, we did how to gather or capture better audio using separate audio files and then syncing them up with your video. And then in episode 6, that was your big shoot. And hopefully you got your film done. And then in episode 7, we did sound design and titling. And finally, in episode 8, we did iOS accessories to help enhance your filmmaking. I hope you feel you've gained the skills, knowledge, and confidence to go on to create your own films. And I also hope that you continue your filmmaking journey by studying possibly light and color and more advanced editing, sound, and visual effects. And let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see more videos like these in possibly a video iPhoneography Season 2. Until then, please continue to follow @CreativeStation to get inspired to continue your creative journey. See you next time.